I arrived late. Not because I wanted to make an entrance, but because I couldn't bring myself to get out of the car. The church parking lot was already full. The same cousins who used to ignore me at Thanksgiving were gathered on the steps, sipping bottled water and chatting like they were at some backyard barbecue. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring through the windshield, breath fogging the glass. Inside, they were talking about Grandma Eleanor like they had known her. Really known her. They didn't. They knew her money. They knew her cooking. They knew her as the old woman who kept sending them birthday cards with checks they barely remembered to cash. But me. I knew the sound of her laughter when she got too carried away telling ghost stories. I knew the scratch of her pen on paper when she wrote me letters in cursive, the kind no one else in the family bothered to read. I knew the way she hugged tight, with one hand always cupping the back of your neck, like she could protect you from the world with that one touch. I finally stepped out of the car and walked toward the doors, clutching the single white rose I brought instead of a bouquet. I didn't come to perform grief. I came to feel it. The moment I stepped in, I felt it, the judgment. Aunt Lydia looked me up and down like I'd worn the wrong dress. Uncle Paul barely nodded before turning away. My cousin Tasha whispered something behind her hand, and they both giggled. As I made my way down the aisle, it felt like I was walking through a minefield of smirks and sideways glances. "She's only here for the will," I overheard. Did she even talk to Eleanor this year? I ignored them. I walked straight to the front pew, placed my rose on the casket and whispered, "I miss you already." Then I sat in silence, hands folded, shoulders still. They didn't know about the nights Grandma called me when I couldn't sleep. They didn't know about the locked drawer in her writing desk with letters addressed only to me. They didn't know that she made me promise, just 3 weeks before she passed, that I would come to the reading of the will. Not for money, but because she said, "It's going to be poetic, sweetheart." I didn't know what that meant at the time. But something in her voice had told me, it wasn't over yet. After the service, people trickled into the adjoining room for the reception, an awkward mix of lukewarm coffee, stale tea sandwiches, and plastic smiles. The air buzzed with gossip, not grief. I stood near the window, alone with my paper cup of coffee, watching the breeze stir the maple tree outside. It was Grandma's favorite kind of weather. Overcast, gentle wind, just enough chill to wear a shawl. She used to say gray skies made the world more honest. Behind me, the whispers started again. She cried during the eulogy like she's starring in a drama. "Please, when's the last time she even visited? You think she knows Grandma left me the pearls? She'll probably faint when the will skips her." That voice was unmistakable, Tasha. She always said my name like it tasted sour in her mouth. I stayed quiet. But my fingers tightened around the coffee cup until the lid crinkled. They didn't know I used to visit Grandma every Sunday afternoon. That we played Scrabble and listened to old jazz records. That she told me I reminded her of herself when she was young, soft-spoken, observant, and underestimated. They didn't know Grandma cried on the phone with me the night Tasha missed her birthday dinner and didn't even call. They didn't know anything. And worse, they didn't care to. I glanced over my shoulder. Tasha caught my eye and didn't even flinch. A smirk. Like she wanted me to hear. Like this was some kind of competition. The others laughed. That moment, something in me hardened. Not because of the insult, but because I realized this wasn't grief to them. It was a game. And I was just the outsider who wandered in without reading the rules. I tossed the cup and walked outside, pulling Grandma's shawl tighter around my shoulders. I'd worn it today like armor. She once told me, "There's a difference between being quiet and being silent. The quiet ones hear everything." And standing there in the wind, I made myself a promise. Let them laugh. When the will is read, they won't be laughing. I didn't stay long at the reception. After a few more hushed giggles and pointed glances, I slipped out the side door and into the parking lot, where the cold air felt like clarity. I sat in my car, gripping the wheel, not ready to drive off just yet. Instead, I reached into the glove box and pulled out a folded letter. It was worn at the edges, soft from too many rereads. Grandma Eleanor's handwriting curled across the page, old-fashioned and steady. Dear Sam, if you're reading this, it means I've left the party, and hopefully made a bit of a mess on the way out. I smiled through tears. Only she could turn death into a final act of defiance. You were the only one who ever asked how I was really doing. The rest, they showed up when there was money involved. But you showed up when it was just me and my soup-stained cardigan and my broken hip. You always saw me, even when you were hurting. You gave me peace I hadn't felt since your grandfather passed. That's why I did what I did, Sam. I remembered the moment she handed me this envelope, 3 weeks before the funeral, sitting on her sun porch with mugs of chamomile tea between us. Her hands had trembled a little when she gave it to me. Don't open it until after, she'd said. And whatever happens at that will reading, hold your ground. I thought she was exaggerating. Grandma had always had a bit of a flair for dramatics. Cutting pies with a chef's knife, dressing up to take out the trash, watching Matlock like it was a war documentary. But this letter felt different. Intentional. Like she knew what I didn't. She had left something behind. Not just for me but because of me. And the way she said, whatever happens at that will reading, echoed now in my chest. It wasn't just a transfer of assets. It was going to be a reckoning. I folded the letter slowly, tucked it back into the envelope, and placed it on the passenger seat. I wasn't walking into that will reading for the inheritance. I was walking in for her. And I had the feeling she'd left me something much bigger than money. 3 days later I got the official notice. A cream-colored envelope from my grandmother's estate attorney, embossed with gold lettering. Langford and Pierce Estate Law. Inside was a formal invitation to the reading of Eleanor Blake's last will and testament. The date was set for Saturday morning, 10 a.m., at the firm's downtown office. My hand shook as I read it. Not because I expected anything, but because I felt like I was walking straight into a trap, a room full of people who thought I didn't belong. I showed up early, sat in my car again, same knot in my stomach, same pulse in my throat, but this time no tears. Just a letter in my coat pocket and Grandma's voice in my head. Hold your ground, Sam. At 9:58, I stepped into the lobby. And there they were. The whole gallery of smug relatives. Tasha in a blazer that screamed, trust fund. Uncle Paul pacing with a Bluetooth in his ear like a man preparing for a windfall. Aunt Lydia sitting stiff-backed with her legs crossed and her chin tilted up like she was already deciding what wallpaper to buy for the lake house. The second I walked in, it was as if someone lowered the volume, but not the tension. Tasha didn't even bother whispering. She's here. Wonder if she knows Grandma updated the will recently. Poor thing might still think she's getting the cottage. Few chuckles followed. Someone muttered, maybe she'll get the garden gnome collection. I said nothing. I just took my seat. Because what they didn't know was that Grandma told me she updated the will. And she didn't do it lightly. A moment later the door opened, and Mr. Langford walked in. Polished, graying, with a worn leather briefcase and an expression like he'd seen far too many family bloodbaths play out across mahogany tables. He greeted the room, sat down, and opened the file slowly. Before we begin, I must inform you that Mrs. Blake made substantial amendments to her estate plans 6 months prior to her passing. These changes were documented, signed, and witnessed legally. Chairs shifted. Tasha frowned. Aunt Lydia raised an eyebrow. Uncle Paul leaned forward like a cat smelling blood. Substantial amendments? Someone asked. Yes, Mr. Langford replied. Mrs. Blake also requested that certain assets be disclosed, in order. He cleared his throat. The air tightened. Had begun. And no one in that room was ready for what was coming. Mr. Langford adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began. To my son, Paul Blake, I leave the antique wine cabinet, and my cookbook collection. The room blinked. Paul's jaw twitched. That's it. Mr. Langford nodded. Correct. No monetary bequest. Aunt Lydia scoffed. Surely that's a mistake. My mother promised me. Mrs. Blake's instructions were very clear, the lawyer replied flatly. She specifically requested that the remainder of the family hear each item without interruption. Lydia pursed her lips and sat back like someone trying to swallow vinegar. To my niece Tasha, Mr. Langford continued, I leave the silver locket she admired at Christmas 5 years ago. May it remind her that some things only appear valuable. Tasha's smile withered instantly. That's a joke, right? She hissed. No answer. Just the sound of paper shuffling. To my sister Margaret, I leave my piano. You never learned to play it, but you always liked to look like you could. There was a short, stunned silence. I looked around the room, expressions falling like dominoes. They weren't laughing anymore. No jewelry. No trust funds. No vacation homes or stocks or land parcels. Each name called, each item more symbolic than the last. Small things. Intentionally chosen. With words that cut deeper than silence. Each person sat still expecting more. Waiting for the real gifts to come. But they didn't. The air got colder. You could hear the shuffle of coats, the tightening of crossed arms, the confusion behind their fidgeting. They were beginning to realize. She knew. She had seen every false hug. Every performative visit. Every shallow toast and missing phone call. And she'd planned for it. To those I haven't named, Mr. Langford said, please know this. Mrs. Blake believed love without action was simply performance. She loved many of you in theory. But she trusted few in practice. Then he looked at me. And now to Samantha Blake. The room snapped to attention. Tasha actually laughed out loud. Oh, this should be good, she muttered. But I didn't flinch. Because I already knew something none of them did. Grandma had saved me for last. Not because I was forgotten, but because I was the reason the rest were forgotten. Mr. Langford paused. He didn't rush. He looked right at me, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement that says, you already know, but it still deserves to be said aloud. Then he opened a separate envelope, marked with a red wax seal bearing my grandmother's initials. This portion, he said slowly, was handwritten by Mrs. Blake herself, to be read aloud in her words. He unfolded the letter and began. To my granddaughter Samantha Blake, my little bird who learned to sing even when no one listened. The room froze. You were never the loudest, never the most demanding, but you were always the most present. You showed up when I was sick, not for the inheritance, but with soup. You called just to say hi. You wrote letters. You remembered stories I told once and never had to repeat. You saw me, truly saw me. I blinked fast. My chest tightened. So to you, Sam, I leave what the rest were too blind to see the value of. I leave you my home, because you never asked me when I'd be ready to move out. Audible ones. I leave you the lake cottage, because you remember how I liked my tea on the porch, even when everyone else forgot I existed. Aunt Lydia muttered something under her breath. I leave you my investment portfolio, not for your gain, but because I trust you'll do something meaningful with it. And finally I leave you my silence. The silence you filled with kindness, not noise. The silence they always mistook for weakness. Mr. Langford folded the letter with reverence and placed it back into the envelope. Silence flooded the room. Tasha looked like she'd been slapped. Paul's lips parted, but no words came out. Lydia gripped her purse like it might dissolve. So, she gets everything? Someone finally asked, voice cracking. Yes, Langford said calmly. Mrs. Blake made no alternate arrangements. Miss Blake is the sole beneficiary of all remaining assets, properties and holdings. I sat motionless, still absorbing it. Not out of shock, but because, known. Grandma told me this was coming. Not the details but the weight. She told me I'd have to carry it with grace. So I didn't cry. I didn't smirk. I just stood up, adjusted my coat, and nodded once to Mr. Langford. Then I turned and walked out. No gloating. No speeches. Because Grandma had already said everything that mattered. And now they finally knew what silence sounded like, when it spoke the truth. By the time I reached my car, my phone had already buzzed twice. Tasha. Hey, we should talk. Maybe meet for coffee. Aunt Lydia. I know things were tense today. But family is family. Let's catch up soon, sweetheart. I stared at the screen. 2 hours ago they could barely look at me without smirking. Now suddenly I was sweetheart. Suddenly they remembered I existed. I didn't reply. Not because I was bitter. But because I'd spent most of my life trying to earn their affection. Bending. Shrinking. Apologizing for simply being in the room. Trying to make myself small enough to be tolerated. But today, I inherited more than a house or a stock portfolio. I inherited truth. I inherited the silence they never respected. I inherited the legacy of a woman who was overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed by the very people now clawing at my attention. I scrolled further. Uncle Paul had sent a LinkedIn request. Cousin Jenna sent a heart emoji. And Tasha again. Grandma wouldn't want us to be distant, Sam. Please. Don't let this come between us. Come between us. They were never with me. When Grandma was hospitalized last winter, I was the only one who sat beside her each night, reading aloud her favorite books. They were busy posting pictures from Cancun. They weren't there when she whispered that she didn't trust any of them to keep the house intact. That they'd sell it before her favorite tea kettle cooled down. So no, this didn't come between us. This just exposed what was always there. I powered off my phone and looked out the windshield. The sun had broken through the clouds, spilling light across the hood of my car. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt like someone who had stopped chasing people who never clapped for her. Someone who no longer needed validation from a table she was never truly invited to. Grandma hadn't just left me her estate. She left me my freedom. And I didn't owe anyone an explanation for what came next. 3 days later, I drove up to the lake house. It was just how I remembered it. Nestled between 2 crooked birch trees, its white shutters peeling at the edges, the porch still creaking with every breeze. Grandma always said the house had a soulful slouch, like it leaned just a little bit toward the water on purpose, as if listening. I parked the car and stood there for a while, keys in hand, unsure of why I felt nervous. I had been here countless times as a child, and yet now, it felt sacred, like entering a memory instead of a house. Inside the air was cool and still. Dust floated gently in sunbeams through the windows. The mismatched quilts were folded neatly on the couch. Her reading glasses sat atop a crossword puzzle she never finished. And on the mantel, an envelope, plain, cream-colored. My name in that familiar looping cursive. For Sam, one last thing. I stood frozen for a second before walking over and picking it up. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside a short note. If you're reading this, then it means you stayed the course. I knew you would. I never worried about the others. But you. I worried they'd make you feel like you had to earn your place. You never did. You were always enough. This house is yours now. Not because of what you did, but because of who you are. Keep the porch light on, the tea warm, and the radio playing Billie Holiday. And whenever you feel alone, remember, the best revenge is not proving them wrong. It's building a life so peaceful, they wonder why they were never invited. P.S. Check the floorboard under the old rocking chair. I left something that always made me feel safe. I wiped my eyes and laughed quietly through tears. Of course there was a secret floorboard. I knelt down by the old rocker, pulled up the loose panel, and found a velvet pouch. Inside was the small gold ring she used to wear on her pinky, a delicate little thing with an opal in the center. She once told me it was her mother's. And now it was mine. I slipped it onto my finger. Fit perfectly. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like I had to defend my place in this family, or in this world. I was exactly where I belonged. I stayed at the lake house that night. No phone, no TV. Just the quiet hum of cicadas and the gentle lapping of water against the dock out back. I sat on the porch swing wrapped in one of Grandma's old quilts, staring into the darkness where the lake met the trees. And for once, I didn't feel like I had to be strong. I just let myself exist. All those years I spent chasing approval from people who couldn't see me, even when I was standing right in front of them, suddenly felt so far away. Like I had been holding on to a version of myself that never actually had a home. But here this was home. Not because it was passed down. Not because it was filled with heirlooms. But because someone who truly knew me, loved me, and saw me decided I was enough to carry her legacy forward. I could have called the others back. I could have flaunted what they lost, made social posts, written checks in their names just to twist the knife. But I didn't. Because as Grandma said, revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet peace. It's choosing not to explain yourself. It's building a life that whispers, "You were wrong about me," without ever saying it aloud. The next morning, I opened all the windows and let the light in. Made tea. Fed the blue jays on the railing. And turned on the old radio. Billie Holiday's voice crackling through the static, just like Grandma loved. I looked around the cottage and whispered, "I'll take care of it. I promise." Not just the house, but the spirit she left behind. The strength, the softness, the ability to see people even when they're hiding in plain sight. That was the real inheritance. And I was done shrinking for people who couldn't measure anything without belittling others first. I was done being the silent one in the corner of the room. Now I had my own space. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that away again. A few weeks later I got a letter in the mail. Not from a lawyer, not a bill or some formal notice, but a handwritten note from Tasha. It was in a pastel pink envelope. The kind she used to mail birthday invitations no one wanted to attend. Inside, a carefully worded apology. "I've been thinking about how things played out. Maybe we let emotions get the best of us. I hope we can find a way to be close again. Family matters, Sam." She underlined family. There was no mention of Grandma. No ownership of the things she'd said. No recognition of the cruelty or the years she'd spent dismissing me unless I was useful. Just a soft plea. A suggestion that I should be the one to fix the distance she created. I folded the note, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in the drawer with a dozen others. Unanswered texts, voicemails, and fake invitations wrapped in obligation. Because closure didn't come in a reply. It came from not needing to reply at all. I walked out to the dock with my tea, the sun low and golden, reflecting off the lake like it had something to say. Grandma once told me, "Some storms clear out more than clouds, they clear out people." And standing there, listening to nothing but birds and water and the hush of wind in trees, I knew I had weathered mine. I didn't need a reunion. I didn't need a holiday miracle or a family sit-down where everyone pretended the past was just a misunderstanding. What I needed, what I had, was peace. The kind no one could give me. The kind no one could take away. I had Grandma's house. Her ring. Her shawl. Her stories. And most of all I had myself. Unapologetic, unmoved, and finally, unburdened. The silence gave me clarity. And with that clarity came a decision. One I knew Grandma would smile at. She always used to say, "If you've got more than you need, build a longer table, not a taller fence." So that's what I started doing. The money she left me sat in a portfolio, quiet and waiting. But it didn't feel right just letting it grow while her legacy faded into the walls of the lake house. I wanted to make something live. That's when I remembered the tiny public library in her neighborhood, the one she used to walk to every Thursday to check out gardening books and mystery novels. The place had peeling paint, broken steps, and a donation jar that had more pennies than promise. I drove there on a rainy afternoon and asked to speak to the director. We sat in a cramped office stacked with paperbacks and quiet desperation. "I'm not here for a tax write-off," I told her. "I'm here because someone I loved spent half her life here, and I want to keep that love alive." Within 2 weeks, a plan was born. The Eleanor Blake Literacy Grant. Fully funded. No paperwork circus. No press releases. Just books, scholarships, new shelves, community reading nights, and paid internships for young women from underrepresented communities. I didn't put my name on anything. It wasn't about recognition. It was about legacy. The kind that outlives gossip and bitterness. The kind that plants seeds quietly and watches them bloom in silence. I visit once a week. Sit in the children's section with my tea. Watch a little girl trace words with her fingers like they were spells. And every time I walked in, I could almost hear Grandma say, "See, this is how we last. Not in stone, but in stories." I never planned to see them again. But life has a strange way of circling back just when you've made peace with leaving it all behind. It was a fundraiser gala for the literacy program, organized by the library, nothing extravagant, just local donors, teachers, and a few community leaders. They asked me to come, quietly, as the anonymous benefactor. I agreed on one condition: no public recognition. But someone must have talked, because when I arrived, barely through the lobby, I heard it. Samantha turned, and there they were, Usha, Aunt Lydia, even Uncle Paul, all dressed in their finest regret. Tasha's eyes widened like she'd just seen a ghost wrapped in confidence. Lydia clutched her glass of wine a little tighter. Paul gave that half-smile he used when trying to act like the past didn't happen. "Didn't know you'd be here," Tasha said, voice sugary with just a dash of panic. "Didn't know you even knew about libraries," I replied, calm as ever. The silence that followed. Perfect. They tried to recover. Tasha attempted a compliment. Lydia asked about the house. Paul offered a handshake. All of it felt like walking into a room of mirrors, everything reflective but nothing real. Then one of the library staff approached and handed me a card. It was from the youngest grant recipient, a 12-year-old girl who wrote, "Thank you for giving me a place to read where no one makes fun of my voice." Smiled. Genuinely. And in that moment, surrounded by people who used to make me question my worth, I didn't feel vengeful. I felt unreachable. I tucked the card into my clutch, turned to my family, and simply said, "I'm not angry anymore. But I'm also not available." Then I walked away. Not to make a statement, not to be dramatic, but because I had somewhere better to be. The following weekend, I returned to the town cemetery. It was a crisp morning. Leaves were starting to turn. The kind of morning Grandma would have called a good day for a walk and a strong cup of tea. I brought both. An old tartan thermos filled with Earl Grey and a small bouquet of wildflowers from the lakehouse garden. Her gravestone was modest, just how she wanted. No gold trim. No fancy marble. Just her name, her birth and death dates, and a quiet engraving. Love with presence. Speak with silence. I knelt down, brushing a few stray leaves off the base, and set the flowers at her side. There were no tears this time. Just warmth. "You were right about all of it," I whispered. I told her about the girl who got the grant. About the gala. About the family trying to crawl back without ever learning how to stand tall. "But you don't have to worry. I'm not bitter. I'm full." And I was. Full of something so much more powerful than revenge. Full of clarity, peace, and a legacy that grew louder the more I let go of needing to prove anything. I sat beside her for a long while, sipping tea, watching the trees sway above us. No music, no traffic, no noise. Just me and her. And a silence that no longer hurt. A silence that meant presence. A silence that meant I was exactly who she raised me to be. When I finally stood, I smiled. "You gave me everything. Now I'll make sure it lives longer than both of us." And with that I walked away. Not out of grief. Not out of goodbye. But because she'd already walked the first half of this journey for me. And now I could walk the rest. Alone but never lonely. I went back to the lake house a week later, but this time I didn't unpack. The porch still creaked the same. The curtains still swayed with the wind off the lake. The birds still came to the railing every morning, expecting Grandma's ritual handful of seeds. Nothing had changed, except me. I walked through every room slowly, touching the edges of bookshelves, the corner of the dining table, the worn arm of her favorite chair. I whispered memories under my breath, little moments only I remembered because only I was there. And then I stood in the middle of the living room and said it aloud. "It's time to let someone else feel this peace." Not because I needed to move on, but because healing, when complete, becomes a gift. And gifts are meant to be passed on. I didn't sell the house. Instead, I contacted the same nonprofit that helped low-income families recover after hardship. I had the lake house placed into a living trust, designated for short-term stays, retreats, and weekends of silence for women who needed what I once did. Space to breathe. No press. No names on plaques. Just a handwritten note left in the entryway. This home was once given to a girl who felt invisible. It reminded her that presence is not measured by noise, but by love. Take what you need. Leave it better than you found it. And always steep the tea before the water cools. I locked the front door one last time and left the key under the flower pot. As I drove away, I didn't feel like I was losing anything. I felt like I was growing the circle. Letting the silence speak again. Letting Grandma's presence echo far beyond what a will could hold. Letting the legacy live. 3 years passed. Not in a rush, but like slow, meaningful footsteps. I built a quiet life. Not flashy. Not curated for anyone else's approval. Just grounded. I still volunteered with the library's literacy program. The grant now supported over a dozen young women annually. The lake house. Still standing, loved, cared for, its porch always swept, its windows always open to the breeze. I visited once a year, never stayed overnight. It wasn't mine anymore. That was the point. And the family. They drifted into the background, like noise turned down until it vanished completely. Every so often, a holiday card would arrive. Thinly veiled attempts at reconnection, always signed love with nothing loving in them. But I didn't return to bitterness. Because I had learned the difference between silence that suffocates and silence that protects. Chose the latter. One evening, I stood on my apartment balcony in the city, sipping tea out of Grandma's old mug, the one with a tiny chip in the handle that somehow made it feel more alive. I watched the city lights flicker. I didn't feel lonely. Felt complete. People often think revenge means taking something back. But the best kind, the kind that lasts, is building something so unshakably peaceful that the people who tried to destroy you can't even find a way in anymore. It's becoming someone so rooted in purpose that others no longer define your worth, not through what they gave or what they took. And that's what I had done. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with presence. Grandma had once told me, they'll never understand the power of the quiet ones, until one day they turn around and realize the quiet one built everything that lasted. She was right. Because in the end, I didn't just inherit her house. I inherited her strength, her patience, her grace. And now, I live in a legacy that doesn't scream, but echoes forever.